So one aspect of the Enlightenment ended in things like deism, other kind of rejections of revealed religion. On the other hand, we had other philosophical developments that attempted to rehabilitate religion in the context of supporting Christianity. One of those is what's known as Scottish common sense, sometimes referred to as common sense realism, sometimes also referred to as the Scottish philosophy. Right? And so the Scottish Enlightenment, the Enlightenment in Scotland, led not to this skepticism, but to an attempt to say there are some things we can know religiously. It was started by a couple of thinkers, including Thomas Reid and Dugald Stewart, who were philosophers, university philosophers in the 18th century. Very important as well for other ministers and philosophers, including John Witherspoon, Presbyterian minister, the only minister who signed the Declaration of Independence. Largely what the Scottish common sense thinkers did was took the method of Francis Bacon in the context of science that we talked about before the exam. This idea of inductively reasoning. If you want to know the truth about something, you look at the facts, and out of those facts you make inductive general principles. And so they took that and said, all right, Bacon was using it to make scientific discoveries, but let's apply that to reality and thinking about reality and what's true. And effectively arguing that there is an obviousness that that nature is rational. Right? There's the notion here of common sense, that everybody can know that nature is real. So in response to a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who were trying to be skeptical, right? How can we truly know what's real? Well, we intuitively know, automatically, that we're real, that the things we encounter through our senses are real, this podium exists because I can touch it, I can see it. Very important, of course, as we have already mentioned, the idea of observed data, importance of facts. And then, as we mentioned, that obviousness, the ordinary experience. Right? I don't have to wonder if you exist. I see you there existing. But it's not just the reality of ourselves and the reality of objects that this would help, but the principles of morality and religious beliefs that seem to be obvious. Right? These two were helped along by Scottish common sense. And Scottish common sense would become very important for a lot of Protestant thinkers in the United States and how they approach the Bible. So that's largely the 19th century, and so we'll hold off to that. In the 17th century, we put slavery in politics. This time I've decided to stick it in culture and society, but as with other aspects, it goes past many of these categories. We talked about a couple of things when we were in the 17th century. That what we have there is the start of the slave trade, and how, as the slave trade started, it is bringing Africa, Europe, the Americas interconnected with each other. And that there is this encounter between African traditional religions, Islam, which was present quite a bit in Africa, as well as Christianity. But in the 17th century, there wasn't a very strong concern about missionizing, evangelizing slaves. So we have this complex encounter, but as slavery becomes more a part of the colonies, right? We're talking the period before the Revolution here. As these cash crops are developing, right? Tobacco, indigo, rice. Toward the end of the 18th century, with the development of the cotton gin, then cotton will become a cash crop as well. these large labor forces, people choosing slavery instead of hiring workers. And that's part of the reason why slavery died off in the North. It wasn't that the North was somehow less racist than the South. It was there were no cash crops in the South like there was in the North like there was in the South. Eventually, though, throughout the 18th century, there were several attempts by Christians to try and evangelize slaves. In the early 1700s, the Anglicans, the Church of England, started the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which was an attempt to evangelize the world, but also in the Americas focused on bringing the message to slaves. But a problem arises. What happens once these slaves are baptized? Because a lot of people are concerned that baptism would then require owners to set them free. Eventually it was decided that baptizing slaves did not change their social status. They were still slaves. And in fact, laws were passed in the early part of the 18th century to claim just that. In fact, some ministers would require that baptism would require slaves to agree that baptism did not set them free before they would baptize them. The continual emphasis throughout this time period was on those passages of Scripture that proclaim, "Servants, obey your masters." Anglicans, however, largely did not have a whole lot of success with evangelizing slaves, especially slaves born in Africa. Usually, many people will say, one component of this barrier to conversion was the hypocrisy of white Christians who would try to proclaim the Christian gospel, but then lived elsewhere, or lived in different ways toward them throughout the week. As I mentioned, many of the sermons focused on issues like slaves, obey your masters, don't steal, don't lie, right? A lot of things that would have supported the slave system. While Anglicans weren't successful, in the latter part, or the middle part of the 18th century, some evangelicals were successful. We'll talk more about evangelicalism in a little bit, but part of the reason why evangelicals, which would include groups like Baptists, eventually Methodists, even pure Presbyterians, many of them were successful in the South, in the early period with African slaves, largely because they were willing to license black preachers. They were willing to establish congregations where a black preacher could preach. The Anglicans, however, would not. And so that was one reason, perhaps, that the slaves would be more welcoming of evangelicals. Also, evangelicals in this time period were much more egalitarian, much more about the equality. By the 19th century, however, those very same evangelicals, or their spiritual heirs, were the people arguing for the slave state. Were arguing for the continuance of slavery. All right, so between the 18th and 19th century, there's quite a turnaround. Some slaves welcomed the instruction given by Christian ministers for a couple of reasons. First, it would get them out of work. And so for some time period, instead of being forced out into the fields, you'd be able to sit and listen to somebody teaching. Even though you may not agree with it, you might not be willing to accept it, for some, it was a way to escape work. For others, it made them feel superior. Because as they accepted Christianity, they could then judge their masters because they felt that they were practicing Christianity better than their masters were. Right? And so you're practicing the white man's religion better than the white man did. Right? And so they some welcomed instruction because of that. Others, especially towards the 19th century, used it as a means of rebellion. Right? The concepts of the gospel, freedom, equality, those kinds of things within the gospel message, would gradually would culminate in a variety of slave revolts and rebellions. There were some free blacks in the North that would eventually start their own denominations, usually many of them from within a parent denomination, like the work of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Richard Allen was born a slave in Philadelphia. His master was a lawyer and then later Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He would later be sold along with his family to a planter in Delaware. And then his mother and siblings would later be sold again, separating the family. During this time, he converted to Methodism, became active in spreading the message to his remaining siblings that were still with him and to others. He became determined that being Christians, and a lot of slavery supporters thought this, that slaves being Christian would make them better slaves. Eventually his master would allow Richard to bring in preachers, one of whom would actually convince Richard Allen's master that slavery was wrong. And so he would allow Richard Allen to purchase his freedom. He encouraged him to work for revolutionary forces and gain enough money to be freed. He said, why didn't he just free him? Well, there were laws in place that did not allow those kind of things in southern states where you could just free your slave. Right? There had to be some sort of purchase. And so his master, even though he's convicted that slavery is wrong, the law says you can't just free your slaves. Eventually, Richard would take the last name Allen. He would start preaching, traveling, preaching to whites and blacks, starts the Free African Society with Absalom Jones, as a means for blacks to help each other out economically. Allen and Jones would continue preaching, gain quite a few converts, eventually becoming members of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, a place where there were a lot of tensions between blacks and whites. In November of 1787, white trustees would force blacks in the assembly from the front rows of the gallery to the seats further back. The black church members would then say, we're just leaving. And so they exited altogether. Starting out what they would call the African Church, later renaming it the Bethel African Church. But there ends up being a disagreement between Jones and Allen over which denomination should we associate with. Because essentially Methodism is still within Anglicanism at this time. It's still within the Church of England. So do we associate with this developing Methodist denomination, or do we associate with this developing Episcopal denomination in this post-revolutionary period? Allen and some others want to be Methodists. Jones and others want to be Episcopalians. Jones will eventually become the first African-American Episcopal priest. Race tensions, however, will eventually push Allen and the Bethel Church out of the Methodist fold, and he will start the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church. Questions about the Enlightenment or slavery, any of the things we've talked about?